A History of Pandemics. Part 2. Disease. It's a terrifying prospect, but it has been part of human culture and of all life since the dawn of time. After all, bacteria evolved 3.5 billion years ago, and viruses 1.5 billion years ago, while we modern humans have only been around for 130,000 years. A myriad of infectious pathogens perpetually surround us, causing severe, mild, or even no reaction at all, depending on your health, immunity, and sometimes sheer luck. But when one of these diseases spreads rapidly, infecting thousands, it becomes an epidemic. And when it crosses borders to infect populations in multiple countries and across continents, you have a pandemic. Epidemics and pandemics have occurred countless times in the past, infecting, injuring, and killing millions. They have changed many lives and the course of human history in countless ways. But in the end, humanity has always continued to move forward. And in many cases, we have learned from these outbreaks to develop new techniques of treatment and prevention. Additionally, we have made massive strides forward in sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition, making the human population healthier and less vulnerable to illness than ever before. Let's look back at some of the worst diseases and pandemics in history. In Part 1, we learned about how Europeans who came to the New World brought with them several devastating diseases, including kokolitzli and smallpox. Native Americans had no acquired immunities to these infections and were largely wiped out, paving the way for Europeans to conquer the Aztec Empire and colonize the Americas. But the spread of deadly disease wasn't one way. One notable and terrible infection most Native Americans were immune to was carried east across the Atlantic, where it wrought havoc on the European population. Syphilis. This sexually transmitted bacterial infection causes fever, headaches, muscle pain, rashes, and sores that can disfigure the face and body quite badly. After a few weeks or months, the symptoms disappear, but the bacteria remains in the body in a latent stage. It can then come raging back years later with dementia, dysfunction of multiple organs, intense pain, and death. The first recorded European outbreak of syphilis began in 1495, 3 years after Columbus made contact in America. This outbreak was among French soldiers who were celebrating their invasion of Naples, Italy, with infected sex workers. The scourge thus became known as the French disease. From the 16th through 19th century, syphilis was one of the largest public health problems in Europe, but numbers of infections and deaths were greatly underreported because of the shame and stigma that went along with the disease known to be contracted through sex. The mortality rate was between 8 and 58% and was significantly higher among men. Those infected turned to the only treatment available, mercury. But ingesting this toxin was often worse than the disease it was meant to treat, as it caused anxiety, mood changes, memory loss, depression, tremors, and a host of other problems. The threat of syphilis did have one upside, though. Men, especially those who frequented prostitutes and brothels, began to take precautions to protect themselves, popularizing the use of condoms. To learn more about early condoms, check out my video on the history of birth control. Syphilis continued to devastate humanity until Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. While syphilis is still around today, it can now be effectively treated with antibiotics. The third cholera pandemic. Bacterium Vibrio cholerae attacks the small intestine, causing severe diarrhea, vomiting, and muscle cramps, which leads to deadly dehydration. Untreated, the mortality rate is 50 to 60%. Cholera has its origins in India and has had many outbreaks around the world over the last millennia, but it became a serious worldwide health crisis in the mid-1800s. From the 1840s to 1860s, the more globalized world allowed the disease to spread through Asia, Europe, and Africa via water tainted with the fecal matter of the infected. In 1854, 23,000 people died in Great Britain and 1 million perished in Russia. European immigrants arriving in North America brought the disease with them, killing thousands in New York and other major cities, and along the Oregon and California trails, where as many as 12,000 perished of the disease. British physician John Snow suspected that dirty water was the cause of the pestilence and traced the entire London outbreak to a single water pump in the Soho neighborhood. Officials were highly skeptical, but removed the pump's handle to humor the doctor. And remarkably, new cases of infection dropped off steeply. This new knowledge allowed health officials around the globe to focus on sanitizing water, thus relieving much of the world of yet another dreaded disease. Unfortunately, clean water is not available to everyone, especially those living in the developing world. Cholera still infects 3 to 5 million people worldwide and causes as many as 130,000 deaths a year. The Third Plague Pandemic. In the 1850s, while cholera was busy spreading around the world, another old chestnut reemerged, the bubonic plague. This time, infection began in the Yunnan province of China and was, as usual, transported by rodents infested with fleas. The plague was spread through the world via trading ships, but most of the devastation was concentrated in Asia, particularly in China and Mongolia. It was then transmitted between the British colonies of Hong Kong and India, where 10 million died. The British colonial government attempted to control the pandemic by imposing quarantine, isolation camps, travel restrictions, and by banning traditional Indian medicine. The measures enforced by the might of the British Army were seen as repressive and tyrannical by the Indian people, and contributed to unrest and rebellion. In the 1890s, scientists in Hong Kong finally discovered that the plague was caused by Bacterium Yersinia pestis and carried by fleas. The introduction of insecticides and antibiotics greatly reduced the spread of the disease. Russian scientist Valdemar Hofkin developed a vaccine for the plague and tested it on himself. He then used Indian prisoners for further human trials. But the vaccine was effective and saved millions of lives, relieving the world of yet another terrible scourge. The Spanish flu. In 1918, just as the horror of the First World War was coming to an end, the world was struck with one of the worst pandemics in history. It is unclear where the rapid spread of the H1N1 influenza virus originated. It has been hypothesized that it began in China, France, or in Kansas in the US. China is thought to be the most likely source, while the other two were probably hubs of mutation and transmission. The virus is airborne and spreads through the sneezes and coughs of those infected. World War I troops were living and working in close quarters and traveling around the world, so during the final months of the war, this allowed the deadly influenza to spread rapidly. Even remote locations like the Pacific Islands and Antarctica were hit by the disease. Germany, the UK, the US, and other nations locked in battle suppressed media coverage of the disease, while the newspapers of neutral Spain freely reported on the horrors of the outbreak. This led to the false impression that Spain was especially hard hit by the influenza. Thus it was dubbed the Spanish flu. Many communities enacted social isolation measures, including canceling public events and closing schools, which significantly reduced the spread of the disease. In Philadelphia, public health officials ignored warnings and allowed a war bonds parade to go ahead. And in San Francisco, business and theater owners fought against public gathering bans and remained open. Both cities saw overwhelming rises in their infection and death rates. 500 million people were infected, and as many as 100 million people perished. In addition to the usual flu symptoms of fever, coughing, runny nose, sore throat, aches, and fatigue, victims experienced bleeding from the nose, ears, stomach, and intestines. While the majority of diseases are most deadly in the very old, very young, and those who are already ill, the Spanish flu hit healthy young people especially hard. This is because it caused the immune system to go into overdrive, causing more damage to the body. So the healthier the immune system, the more devastating the results. Soldiers who thought they had escaped death on the battlefield met their end in the sickbed, and young parents left behind hundreds of thousands of orphans. The Spanish flu finally died out in December of 1920, but it had claimed the lives of 1 in 20 people around the world. Young people especially felt lucky to be alive when friends, neighbors, brothers, and sisters might not be. As a result, the 1920s saw seismic changes in art, music, and culture. To learn more, check out my video on the Roaring 1920s. HIV/AIDS. Human immunodeficiency virus is believed to have developed in primates in West Central Africa. It was likely transmitted to humans who hunted, butchered, and consumed these primates as meat. The first known infection of a human was in 1908. In the first half of the 20th century, European colonists in West Africa built large cities, and many local women had no choice but to turn to prostitution, allowing the infection to spread. Following the Congo's independence from Belgium in 1960, the UN recruited thousands of French-speaking doctors, lawyers, and other experts from around the world to travel to the Congo and fill in jobs left empty by the departing colonial government. While they were there helping to set up the new Congolese nation, many of these experts also contracted HIV, which they then carried back to their homelands. Haiti contributed the second largest number of experts, and it is thought that Haiti became the entry point for HIV to spread to the United States. HIV is contracted via contaminated blood transfusions, hypodermic needles, from mother to child during pregnancy, delivery, or breastfeeding, and most prominently by unprotected sex. Following initial infection, a person often experiences a brief flu-like illness. Typically, this is followed by a prolonged period of no symptoms, during which the carrier may unknowingly infect others. Months or even years later, the pathogen begins to seriously interfere with the immune system, increasing the risk of developing other illnesses such as tuberculosis and tumors. This is why most don't die from HIV itself, but from complications brought on by other infections. When HIV has progressed into the late stages, it is referred to as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. We know a great deal now about what HIV is, how it is spread, and how to prevent it. But when infections first appeared in the late 1970s, people had no idea why healthy young men in their 20s and 30s were suddenly dying of minor infections and rare cancers. Men who have sex with men are at an increased risk of infection, and HIV spread especially quickly in their community. Unaware of the source and spread of the mysterious disease, it became known as GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, or sometimes the gay cancer or the gay plague. HIV and AIDS were identified and named in the early 1980s and came to define the decade. Fear and stigma surrounding the disease led to avoidance, homophobia, and even violence. Other groups were also being infected, including intravenous drug users and people with hemophilia, who were frequently treated with therapies derived from human blood. Throughout the 80s and 90s, fear was rampant as the LGBT people in particular saw their friends and family dying in droves and dreaded a death sentence diagnosis. Hospitals were overwhelmed with cases, and the Reagan administration was particularly callous in their response, or lack thereof, to the crisis. As the government and media spread panic, the LGBT community felt abandoned. Community leaders created their own information campaigns on how to practice safe sex and prevent infection. Celebrities like American actor Rock Hudson and British rock star Freddie Mercury died, raising the profile of the disease. The crisis had a massive effect on the LGBT equal rights movement, as people were no longer fighting for their rights, but their right to live. 3 decades later, 70 million people have been infected with HIV, and 36 million have died. But education about HIV has gone mainstream, and the stigma has been reduced. A diagnosis is no longer a death sentence. Antiviral drugs and other therapies allow those living with HIV to survive as long as those without, and scientists report being close to developing a cure. though infection remains rampant in sub-Saharan Africa, where prevention education and treatment is still decades behind the developed world. Throughout history, there have always been diseases and pandemics, and there will likely always be. While that is a terrifying thought, humanity has thankfully taken massive strides in science, healthcare, and education, often as the direct result of the pandemics of the past. We have significantly improved hygiene and nutrition, making the human population healthier and stronger than ever before. Thus, we are far less susceptible to contracting and spreading infection, and far more likely to survive if we do. Neolithic people could expect to live to their mid-20s, and by 1900, the world average life expectancy had reached only 31 years of age. Lives were short, and infant and childhood mortality particularly high, in great part because of human vulnerability to infectious diseases. But as of 2019, the world average life expectancy has more than doubled to reach 72.6 years. And in many developed countries, life expectancy is in the mid-80s. While we will likely never be free from the fear of infection, we have more tools than ever to fight against it. If you want to stay healthy and avoid or survive disease, now is by far the best time in history to be alive. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.